In the middle of World War II, while battles raged across Europe and the Pacific, another war was being fought far from the front lines, one of steel speed and impossible ambition. The United States was losing ships faster than it could build them. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant convoys by the dozens each week. Every torpedo that struck meant more soldiers stranded, more supplies lost, and victory pushed further away. Then came a man who on paper should have had nothing to do with ships, Henry J. Kaiser. A dam builder. Not a shipwright, stepped forward with an outrageous promise he could build an ocean-going cargo ship faster than anyone in history. In 1940, Kaiser had never built a single vessel. 5 years later, his shipyards would produce 490 Liberty ships, simple, rugged freighters that became the lifeline of the Allied war effort. His boldest feat, the construction of the SS Robert E. Peary, a full-sized Liberty ship assembled in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, a record that stands unbroken. While traditional shipyards scoffed, Kaiser replaced centuries-old riveting with welding, turned shipbuilding into an assembly line industry, and opened the doors of his yards to over 196,000 workers, including more than 40,000 women. He transformed skepticism into awe, and in doing so, changed the face of American industry forever. This is the story of how one civilian's audacity redefined the limits of production, created a fleet that conquered the seas, and proved that sometimes the greatest battles are won not with bullets, but with ideas. In 1939, the world once again found itself descending into chaos. Across Europe, the drums of war echoed louder with each passing month. Germany, rearmed and resurgent, had unleashed its blitzkrieg lightning war upon Poland, France, and soon all of Western Europe. Within a year, the Nazi flag flew from Paris to Oslo. The Axis seemed unstoppable. Yet even as Europe burned, America hesitated. The scars of the First World War were still fresh. Isolationist voices in Congress and the press insisted the Atlantic was wide enough to keep the conflict away. But the tide of war has a way of erasing distances. By 1940, Britain stood alone against Hitler's empire. Its cities pounded nightly by the Luftwaffe. Its convoys hunted across the Atlantic by packs of German U-boats. The sea, once a highway of commerce, had become a graveyard. Every month, hundreds of Allied ships were sent to the bottom. Tankers, freighters, troop carriers, all torn apart by torpedoes in the cold gray Atlantic. Each vessel carried not only fuel, food, and ammunition, but also time itself, the time the Allies could no longer afford to lose. Without ships, there would be no war effort, no reinforcements, no supplies, and no hope. The British, desperate to sustain their lifeline, turned to the United States for help. And though America was not yet formally at war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood what was at stake. We must become, he declared, the arsenal of democracy. To do that, the United States needed ships, thousands of them. But there was a problem, an invisible enemy more dangerous than any submarine time itself. The shipyards of 1940 were relics of another age. Their methods were slow, meticulous, and deeply traditional. Riveting, a process that required heating, hammering, and fitting metal bolts one by one, was still the backbone of ship construction. It took nearly 230 days to build a single merchant vessel. At that pace, the Allies were doomed before the battle even began. The U.S. Maritime Commission, led by Vice Admiral Emory S. Land, was tasked with fixing this crisis. But even with more funding, more steel, and more workers, the numbers didn't add up. America could not outbuild the Germans unless someone changed the rules entirely. That someone was about to come from the unlikeliest place imaginable, the western deserts of the United States. Henry John Kaiser was not a sailor nor a shipbuilder. He was a contractor, a builder of monumental structures that defied nature itself. His fingerprints were on the Hoover Dam, the Bonneville Dam, and the Grand Coulee massive undertakings that tamed rivers and powered cities. He was in every sense a builder of the impossible. Where others saw problems, Kaiser saw processes. Where they saw limits, he saw systems waiting to be reimagined. When the Maritime Commission asked for new contractors to expand America's shipbuilding capacity, Most experienced firms hesitated. The task was too large, the timelines too short, the technology too old. Kaiser, however, raised his hand. He had never built a ship in his life, but he understood something fundamental. Building is about logistics, not tradition. He had seen what assembly line efficiency had done for the automotive industry. He had watched Ford's River Rouge plant roll out cars with breathtaking speed. Why couldn't ships be built the same way? In Kaiser's mind, shipbuilding didn't have to be an art, it could be an industry. And if done right, it could save the world. By late 1940, with government backing and bold faith, Kaiser began constructing his first shipyard on the West Coast in Richmond, California. It was little more than mud cranes and ambition. But soon, rows of half-finished docks rose from the bay, joined by factories where prefabricated steel sections could be produced simultaneously instead of sequentially. This was the heart of Kaiser's revolution parallel construction. Instead of building ships piece by piece, from the keel upward as tradition demanded, his engineers would build multiple parts at once. Bows, sterns, decks, bulkheads, then weld them together like colossal puzzle pieces. It was an outrageous idea. The old shipwrights called it madness. Rivets had been used for centuries. Welding, they said, would never hold on a vessel that large. The hull will crack under stress, critics warned. Kaiser didn't argue. He simply built. His teams began experimenting with new techniques, bringing in experts from the Permanente Metals Corporation to refine the welding process. Soon they proved that a welded hull was not only faster to assemble, it was stronger. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, the war intensified. German U-boats had sunk more than 500 ships by 1941, strangling the Allied lifeline. Each torpedoed freighter screamed the same truth: America's survival depended not on generals or admirals, but on engineers and builders. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The United States was now officially at war, and suddenly Henry Kaiser's bold gamble was no longer an experiment. It was a national emergency. Within weeks, his shipyards began operating around the clock. Floodlights turned night into day. Sparks rained from welders like falling stars. The clanging of steel and the rhythmic pounding of machinery became America's battle cry. From the quiet shores of California, a new kind of army was rising, not of soldiers, but of builders. Men and women, young and old, pouring into Kaiser's shipyards to do the impossible: turn raw steel into floating lifelines for a world on fire. And as the first Liberty ships slid down the ways, their bows cutting into the cold Pacific waters, few could have imagined that this unlikely man, this builder of dams, would soon redefine the very meaning of speed industry and victory. When Henry Kaiser began building ships, he was not entering an industry, he was rewriting one. In the early days of 1941, before America's full-scale entry into the war, shipbuilding was a proud but stubborn art form. Each ship was crafted from the ground up, a singular masterpiece of wood, steel, and sweat. Every curve was shaped by riveters who passed their trade from father to son. It was craftsmanship, not manufacturing, and that Kaiser believed was precisely the problem. He looked at the shipyards of the East Coast and saw a system trapped by its own tradition. Ships were built linearly, one process at a time. A vessel could not move to the next phase until the previous one was completed. For men who revered heritage, that was discipline. For Kaiser, it was inefficiency. He envisioned something radical, a shipyard that worked like a car factory, a place where multiple components could be built simultaneously and then fused together in perfect synchronization. Kaiser called it modular construction. Each section of the ship would be built separately in fabrication shops: bulkheads, decks, engines, masts, then transported to the slipways and welded into a single hull. To the old engineers, it sounded like heresy. To Kaiser, it was logic. He borrowed minds from the automobile industry and the great dam projects. His engineers developed new jigs cranes and steel handling systems to lift and align massive prefabricated blocks. The design office at Permanente Metals Corporation produced blueprints so precise that each piece could fit with the next like parts of a machine. Every step was timed, measured, and optimized. And for the first time in American history, shipbuilding had a schedule. The birth of the Liberty ship assembly line. Kaiser didn't design the Liberty ship, but he perfected how to build it. The ship itself, standardized by the U.S. Maritime Commission, was simple, functional, and far from beautiful. With a blunt bow and a single screw propeller, it was nicknamed the Ugly Duckling. But what it lacked in grace, it made up for in numbers. To Kaiser, beauty wasn't in form, it was in repetition. His goal was not to craft a masterpiece, but to make shipbuilding repeatable. He built massive fabrication plants beside the docks, each one churning out pre-cut steel plates and sub-assemblies. Overhead, cranes carried completed sections straight to the building slips where welders joined them together under showers of sparks. Work was divided into shifts with 24-hour production cycles. Floodlights lit the night sky. The yards never slept. To make this human machine work, Kaiser built an entire social ecosystem around it. He knew that people, not steel, were his greatest raw material. He opened training centers where unskilled workers could learn welding, fitting, and electrical assembly in a matter of days. He established childcare centers for working mothers and canteens that served thousands of meals a day. He even built neighborhoods around his shipyards so that workers could live within walking distance of the job. His philosophy was simple: a supported worker is an efficient worker. And so, in the midst of war, Kaiser's shipyards became a microcosm of a new kind of America, one where men and women from every background worked side by side toward a common goal. Women at the front lines of production. At a time when the military barred women from combat, Kaiser's shipyards opened their gates wide. By 1943, 1 in 5 workers was female. Housewives, teachers, and waitresses traded aprons for coveralls, welding helmets and gloves. They became the faces of Rosie the Riveter, the icon of the American home front. In Richmond and Oregon, female welders outperformed their male counterparts in both precision and safety records. They were faster, steadier, and more disciplined. Henry Kaiser didn't just give them jobs, he gave them proof that they belonged in industry. The science of speed. What truly set Kaiser apart was his obsession with time. He treated every ship like a stopwatch experiment. If one process took 12 hours, he wanted to know why it couldn't take 6. If a team could assemble a deck in 3 days, he wanted it done in 2. Every success was recorded, analyzed, and replicated across his yards. He pioneered the use of industrial time motion studies, the same techniques that powered Ford's automobile revolution 2 decades earlier. The results were astonishing. By mid-1943, the average Liberty ship construction time had dropped from 230 days to just 42. At peak efficiency, Kaiser's yards launched 1 ship every 5 days. The SS Robert E. Peary, his crown jewel, was the ultimate test. Built at Richmond Yard No. 2, the Peary's keel was laid on a Thursday morning. Crews worked in 24-hour shifts, rotating seamlessly. By Monday evening, the ship slid into the water 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later. It wasn't just an engineering record, it was a psychological weapon. Photos of the Peary's launch were published worldwide. To America, it was proof of unstoppable productivity. To the Axis, it was a grim revelation they could never sink ships faster than Kaiser could build them. The human machine. Inside the shipyards, morale ran high. Workers wore badges showing how many ships their crews had helped launch. Music blared from loudspeakers. Flags were raised with every completion. Kaiser knew the value of symbolism. He turned his yards into spectacles of unity. Politicians, generals, and journalists visited in awe. Admiral Land, once skeptical, now praised Kaiser's industrial genius. President Roosevelt called his work the miracle of the home front. Yet Kaiser never forgot the individual. He often walked the docks himself, shaking hands, asking welders about their tools, fitters about their hours. To him, leadership wasn't command, it was presence. By war's end, Kaiser's 7 shipyards had employed over 190,000 workers. His operations produced more than ships, they produced confidence, a belief that ordinary people given the right system could achieve extraordinary results. He had turned America's shipbuilding industry into an orchestra of efficiency, and every worker, male or female, black or white, skilled or unskilled, played a part. From chaos, he had created coordination. from scarcity abundance, and from doubt victory. By 1943, Henry Kaiser's shipyards had become more than factories. They were monuments to momentum. From the foggy coasts of California to the riverbanks of Oregon, towering cranes swung like metronomes of war, welding torches lit up the night sky, and the sound of progress thundered across the bay. Kaiser's Liberty ships were rolling off the slipways faster than any navy in history could comprehend. What had once taken 230 days to complete could now be done in less than 6 weeks. And at the height of production, Kaiser's team was launching a ship every 5 days, sometimes 2 in a single day. It was industrial poetry. Each launch was a public spectacle. Crowds gathered at Richmond Shipyard No. 2 as horns blared and the great hulls slid into the water, their sides gleaming with fresh paint and hope. For many, it was the first time they'd ever seen something built faster than it could be destroyed. Newspapers called Kaiser the miracle shipbuilder, and President Roosevelt described his yards as the arsenal behind the arsenal of democracy. The numbers were staggering. By the war's end, Kaiser's 7 shipyards had built 1,490 Liberty ships, nearly 1/3 of all such vessels ever produced. Across the nation, other shipyards followed his lead, and together, America delivered 2,710 Liberty ships in total. Each ship carried 10,000 tons of cargo, ranging from ammunition and food to tanks and fuel. Collectively, they moved more than half of all Allied supplies that crossed the oceans during the war. But the Liberty ships were more than steel hulls. They were symbols of resilience. Every vessel bore a name, often of a fallen hero. A writer or a statesman, tributes to human spirit and sacrifice. The SS Booker T. Washington. The first Liberty ship, commanded by an African-American captain, symbolized a new chapter in equality at sea. The SS John W. Brown and SS Jeremiah O'Brien, 2 surviving ships still afloat today, continue to tell the story of that extraordinary era. The 4-day miracle. Among all those thousands of ships, one name became legend, the SS Robert E. Peary. At Richmond Shipyard No. 2, Kaiser announced he would attempt the impossible, build a Liberty ship in under 5 days. To the world, it sounded like madness. To his workers, it was a challenge. For 4 days and 15 hours, thousands of men and women worked in seamless shifts, welding, fitting, painting, and assembling prefabricated sections like pieces of a colossal puzzle. The docks never went silent. Lights blazed through the night, food trucks rolled between crews, and cheers erupted each time a new milestone was reached. When the Peary finally touched water on November 12, 1942, the world gasped. What had been a field of steel fragments less than a week before had become a 441-foot cargo ship ready for sea trials. The feat made headlines worldwide. Even Germany's high command took notice, incredulous that America could build ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The record still stands today, a reminder of what human coordination and belief can achieve under pressure. The human engine. Behind every Liberty ship was an army of civilians, over 190,000 workers, including 40,000 women, and thousands of African Americans, Mexican Americans, and migrants from the Dust Bowl. They were America's unarmed soldiers, fighting not with rifles, but with rivets and welders. For many women, it was their first time earning their own wage. For many men, their first time working beside women as equals. In Kaiser's shipyards, merit mattered more than status. A good welder, no matter her gender or skin color, could become a crew lead. The war forced America to reimagine itself, not only on the battlefield, but at home. Each Liberty ship that slid into the sea carried more than cargo, it carried progress. A weapon of supply and morale. The impact of the Liberty fleet rippled far beyond shipyards. In 1942, when Allied forces landed in North Africa, their success depended entirely on Liberty ships bringing fuel rations and munitions across U-boat-infested waters. The same was true for D-Day in 1944. Without Kaiser's miracle fleet, there would have been no armada capable of sustaining the invasion of Europe. The numbers tell the story. Each Liberty ship could deliver enough supplies to feed and equip 15,000 troops for a month. And when U-boats sank 10 ships, Kaiser could build 20 more. The enemy's arithmetic broke first. Even Hitler's Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, admitted after the war. The astonishing speed with which the Americans built ships was a decisive factor in our defeat. Beyond the war, Kaiser's influence didn't end with victory. His innovations, prefabrication, modular welding, parallel production became the DNA of modern shipbuilding. Japan and South Korea later adopted and refined these techniques, turning them into global shipbuilding powerhouses. And yet, Henry Kaiser's true legacy was not just measured in tonnage, but in transformation. He redefined leadership during crisis. He proved that in times of war, creativity could be more powerful than conformity, and bold ideas could win battles that weapons never could. Even in peace, his name lived on. The Kaiser Permanente health program, originally founded to care for his shipyard workers, evolved into one of America's largest healthcare systems, still serving millions today. From concrete dams to steel ships to medical care, Kaiser had one guiding principle: people are the foundation of every structure. A legacy forged in steel. By the time the last Liberty ship sailed, America had built more ships than all Axis nations combined. The Liberty fleet became the backbone of Allied logistics, the silent bridge between continents. They were slow playing and often called ugly, but they delivered victory. Many were sunk, many scrapped, but the few that remain, like the Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco, stand as living relics of the industrial miracle that changed the course of the 20th century. When you walk their decks today, you can still feel the ghosts of Kaiser's workers, the clang of hammers, the smell of oil and salt, the hum of an empire in motion. Henry Kaiser never designed a ship, never commanded one, and never went to sea in battle. Yet few men have ever done more to win a war without firing a single bullet. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world took stock of what it had gained and what it had lost. Nations lay in ruins, but amid the ashes stood one extraordinary symbol of rebirth industry. And no single man embodied that transformation more completely than Henry J. Kaiser. The Liberty ships had done their job. They had carried the fuel, the food, and the faith that powered victory. But their true legacy was not confined to the ocean. It was written into the blueprint of modern civilization itself. The birth of the modern shipyard. Before Kaiser, shipbuilding was an art. After Kaiser, it was an industry. His revolutionary use of modular construction, welding, and prefabrication became the foundation upon which every major shipyard of the modern age was built. From the 1950s through today, shipyards in Japan, South Korea, and China have followed the assembly line philosophy he pioneered. The world's largest shipbuilders, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Hyundai Heavy Industries, and Daewoo, owe part of their efficiency to the model that Kaiser proved under fire. Even the construction of nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers in the United States today relies on his fundamental approach: multiple modules built separately, then welded together into a single hull. In transforming how ships were made, Kaiser had redefined how time could be conquered. He turned steel into a language of speed, and the world never forgot that lesson. The economic ripples. At the height of the war, Kaiser's shipyards had employed over 190,000 people, injecting billions into the wartime economy. When peace came, those same workers carried their skills and their sense of purpose into peacetime industries. The West Coast, once a quiet frontier, was now a manufacturing powerhouse. Cities like Richmond, Oakland, Portland, and Vancouver became industrial hubs, launching America into its post-war boom. Women who had joined the workforce under Kaiser didn't simply vanish back into domestic life. Many stayed. Many demanded equality. The Rosie, the Riveter generation had seen what they could do, and they refused to be forgotten. Kaiser's inclusive labor policies had unintentionally helped ignite the early sparks of the women's rights movement in America. Equally profound was his impact on healthcare. During the war, the grueling pace of shipbuilding led to injuries, fatigue, and illness. Kaiser realized that a healthy workforce was as essential as efficient machinery. He launched an experiment: affordable employer-backed healthcare for his employees. That experiment became Kaiser Permanente, a name that would outlive the Liberty ships and continue to shape America's healthcare system. What began as a wartime necessity became one of the first successful models of managed care offering comprehensive services for working families. It was once again an industrial solution to a human problem. Psychological victory. The Liberty ships also won an invisible war, a psychological one. For the Allies, they were proof that America could outbuild any enemy. For ordinary citizens, they showed that their hands mattered as much as any soldier's rifle. Every rivet, every weld, every ship launched was a morale booster broadcast over radio and print. When the first Liberty convoy successfully crossed the Atlantic in 1942, newspapers hailed it as a victory of American muscle and ingenuity. For the first time, civilians felt like combatants in a war of production. For the Axis, it was a nightmare. German intelligence estimated that if America maintained its shipbuilding rate for another year, U-boats would become irrelevant. They were right. By late 1943, Liberty ships were replacing lost tonnage faster than submarines could sink them. The tide of the Atlantic War turned not with a battle, but with a balance sheet. Even Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels admitted in his diaries, "The Americans have an uncanny ability to produce. Their factories are our real enemy." Kaiser had weaponized efficiency, influence beyond shipbuilding. After the war, Kaiser didn't stop building, he simply changed materials. He founded Kaiser Aluminum, Kaiser Steel, and Kaiser Motors, bringing the same philosophy of mass production and streamlined logistics to every sector he touched. In housing, he championed prefabricated homes for returning veterans. In medicine, he built hospitals with modular components that could be replicated across cities. He saw no line between industry and humanity, both he believed could be improved by design. His shipyards also became the training ground for a generation of engineers and industrial planners who would later rebuild war-torn Europe and Japan. The Marshall Plan, which revived Western economies, borrowed heavily from the logistical lessons Kaiser had demonstrated in Richmond. And across the Pacific, young engineers from Japan studied American industrial methods, carrying home the seeds that would bloom into the Japanese manufacturing renaissance of the 1960s. In a very real sense, Kaiser didn't just help win World War II, he helped shape the post-war world order, legacy in motion. Today, when a supertanker glides from a Korean dockyard, or when a high-speed train assembly line hums in Germany, Henry Kaiser's fingerprints are there. His insistence that complex systems could be simplified and that people could be empowered to master them still drives global industry. Even the NASA Apollo missions benefited from his legacy. The modular design of the Saturn V rocket, stages the precision welding of spacecraft hulls, all trace their conceptual lineage back to the industrial thinking of World War II's homefront innovators like Kaiser. Yet perhaps his greatest influence is philosophical. He taught that innovation isn't invention, it's improvement. That progress doesn't always require genius, but courage, the courage to question what everyone else accepts as truth. In 1940, the shipbuilding elite said it couldn't be done. In 1942, Kaiser proved them wrong, and by 1945, the impossible had become routine. The human dimension. For those who worked in his shipyards, the impact lasted a lifetime. Veterans of the Richmond yards spoke of it with reverence, the lights, the noise, the unity. It wasn't just a job one worker recalled decades later. It was a mission. We were building victory with our hands. That sense of collective purpose, the merging of individual effort into national destiny, was one of Kaiser's greatest legacies. He had shown what happens when a nation believes that every citizen armed not with weapons but with willpower can change history. A new definition of power. In the end, the Liberty ships were not just machines of war, they were metaphors for the age that followed. They embodied the idea that strength lies in adaptability, that progress is born from daring to challenge the old order. Kaiser turned war into a classroom of innovation. The lessons learned there, efficiency, inclusion, and the value of human dignity in labor, became the cornerstones of the modern industrial world. More than any general or admiral, Henry J. Kaiser proved that the power to win a war lies not only in the battlefield, but in the workshop, the factory, and the imagination. And long after the last Liberty ship rusted away, His legacy continued to sail quietly and visibly through every shipyard, hospital, and city that dared to build something faster, better, and together. The war ended, and the great engines of Kaiser's shipyards finally went silent. The cranes stood still, their hooks swaying gently in the wind. The sparks that once lit the night sky faded into memory. But the echoes of what those men and women built, the rhythm of welders, the thunder of launches, the roar of crowds, still lingered over the bays of Richmond. Today, if you walk along those quiet docks, the ghosts of the past still whisper. You can almost hear the welders calling out orders, the blare of horns as another Liberty ship slides into the sea, the laughter of women in coveralls who once changed the world. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien and SS John W. Brown, two surviving Liberty ships, still sail floating museums of steel and spirit. Their decks carry not only the weight of history, but the breath of the people who proved that imagination could become industry, and that ordinary hands could perform extraordinary miracles. Henry Kaiser never wore a uniform. He never led troops into battle. Yet his war was no less important. His battlefield was the shipyard. His soldiers were civilians, and his weapon was belief that there is no limit to what people can achieve when they refuse to accept impossible. As the camera pans across the rusting cranes of Richmond and settles on the shining hull of a Liberty ship cutting through calm waters, one truth remains. Victory isn't only forged in blood, it's welded, riveted, and dreamed into being by those who dare to build when others only fear to fight.